April 12, 1945. 8 miles north of Okinawa, Lieutenant Seizō Yasunori, Imperial Japanese Navy, gripped the control stick of his Mitsubishi, a 6M0. The morning haze blurred the American destroyer he'd been ordered to destroy. Suddenly, the air between his cockpit and the target came alive. It wasn't just tracer fire. Walls of blazing 40mm shells, thick and endless, leapt up from every American ship, fusing sky and sea in a barrier of firepower that defied everything he'd expected. Yasunori had been told the Americans were exhausted, their anti-aircraft gunners slow and inaccurate. Commanders assured him no gun could stop the sheer will of a man in a kamikaze dive. But as he dove, the explosions burst too close, spitting lethal shrapnel. Some of his comrades vanished mid-descent, their engines flaming out, wings torn by unseen detonations. These weren't ordinary shells. His mind scrambled to process it, detonations triggered before impact, filling the approach with deadly fragments. The walls seemed solid, unbroken, impossible to pass through. How had the Americans conjured this curtain of death? What weapon could unleash such relentless force, with such machine precision, at precisely the moment his commanders promised glory? Yasunori fought the instinct to pull up. His duty demanded sacrifice, but doubt flooded his mind. Had the Empire sent him to die against something even courage and devotion could not defeat? As he streaked toward the roaring barrier, one question echoed: what kind of weapon could turn certain sacrifice into certain failure? The kamikaze strategy wasn't born from strength, it emerged from desperation. By October 1944, Japan's Pacific defenses were collapsing. Admiral Takijiro Ohnishi, newly appointed commander of the 1st Air Fleet in the Philippines, faced an impossible arithmetic: hundreds of American warships supporting General MacArthur's return to Leyte Gulf, and barely enough trained pilots and functioning aircraft to mount conventional resistance. On October 29, 1944, Ohnishi gathered his remaining officers and proposed what had been whispered but never officially endorsed: organized suicide attacks. He called them Shinpū Tokkōtai, Divine Wind Special Attack Units, invoking the typhoons that saved Japan from Mongol invasion in 1274 and 1281. If skilled pilots couldn't sink American carriers, perhaps sacrifice itself could become a weapon. The first organized kamikaze attack launched on October 25, 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. 5 Mitsubishi, a 6M0 fighters, each loaded with a 250-kilogram bomb and piloted by volunteers from the 201st Air Group, dove on the escort carrier task group Taffy 3. At 10:53 in the morning, Lieutenant Yukio Seki's Zero smashed through the flight deck of USS St. detonating bombs and aviation fuel. 18 minutes later, St. sank, the first Allied carrier destroyed by kamikaze. That same day, kamikazes damaged 5 other escort carriers. American commanders were stunned. Conventional anti-aircraft fire, designed to deter attacks and force evasive maneuvers, proved nearly useless against pilots who never broke off. A damaged aircraft still diving was a missile still deadly. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. Every radar contact now carried the possibility of unavoidable collision. By January 1945, kamikaze attacks had damaged 47 Allied ships across the Philippines campaign. The tactic's effectiveness wasn't measured in precision, but in inevitability. Conventional fighters might abort under heavy fire. Kamikazes absorbed punishment and kept coming. Standard 20mm and 40mm anti-aircraft guns, firing timed fuse shells, required direct hits or precisely set fuse timings to destroy incoming aircraft. Hit rates hovered around 15 to 20% against conventional attackers who maneuvered defensively. Against kamikazes committed to their trajectory, gunners had one chance: destroy the aircraft completely before it reached the ship. Crippling an engine or wounding the pilot meant nothing if momentum carried the aircraft into its target. The mathematics were brutal. Even a 20% destruction rate meant 4 of every 5 kamikazes reached striking distance. The Okinawa invasion, launched April 1, 1945, represented the ultimate test. Okinawa lay just 340 miles from Kyushu, Japan's southernmost home island, close enough that even poorly trained pilots with minimal navigation skills could reach the target zone. The Imperial Japanese Navy and Army Air Forces prepared 10 massive kikusui, floating chrysanthemum, attacks, each involving hundreds of aircraft. The first Kikusui, launched April 6th, deployed 355 kamikaze aircraft and 344 conventional fighters as escorts. American radar operators watched their screens fill with contacts. Task Force 58, supporting the invasion, deployed destroyer picket lines 50 to 75 miles from the main fleet, early warning posts that would absorb the first waves. These destroyers, lightly armored and carrying fewer anti-aircraft guns than battleships or cruisers, became floating targets. Their mission: detect incoming raids, vector combat air patrols to intercept, and survive whatever penetrated the fighter screen. The first week of April proved devastating. By April 7th, 16 American ships had been hit, 6 severely damaged, 2 sunk. Kamikaze pilots targeted the vulnerable picket destroyers with ruthless efficiency. USS Bush took 3 kamikaze hits and sank within hours. USS Colquhoun absorbed 4 strikes and had to be scuttled. The destroyer's 5-inch guns and lighter anti-aircraft armament could engage at range, but the volume of fire proved insufficient. Gunners watched kamikazes absorb hits, engines trailing smoke and flames, yet continue their dives. Seaman First Class Robert W. Hogan, stationed aboard USS Bowers, later recalled the horror. You could see pieces flying off them, wings shredded, but they kept coming. It was like shooting at ghosts that wouldn't die. The psychological toll mounted alongside the casualties. Crews slept in shifts, always at battle stations, knowing the next radar contact might be their last. American casualties climbed with terrifying speed. By mid-April, 34 ships had been sunk outright, 468 damaged to varying degrees. Nearly 4,900 U.S. sailors were killed or wounded, losses exceeding some entire island campaigns. Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz faced a grim calculus. Okinawa had to be secured as the staging base for Operation Downfall, the invasion of Japan itself, but the kamikaze campaign threatened to bleed the fleet white before the final assault even began. Destroyer crews, bearing the heaviest losses, approached mutiny levels of stress. Medical officers reported combat fatigue, insomnia, and psychological breakdown at unprecedented rates. The kamikaze strategy, for all its desperation and wastefulness, was working. Japan couldn't win the war, but it might make victory so costly the Americans would negotiate rather than invade. Yet the U.S. Navy possessed an advantage Japanese High Command hadn't fully accounted for. American industrial capacity and technological innovation operated on a scale Japan could no longer match. Throughout early 1945, nearly every destroyer, cruiser, battleship, and carrier in the Pacific Fleet had been retrofitted with additional anti-aircraft mounts, Swedish-designed Bofors 40mm autocannons, mass-produced in American factories and equipped with a revolutionary technology that would turn the kamikaze's mathematical advantage into a death sentence. Lieutenant James G. Tull, gunnery officer aboard USS Laffey, watched his crew drill on the new systems and wondered if they'd be enough. On April 12th, he'd find out. The weapon that would create walls of fire didn't originate in American arsenals, it came from neutral Sweden. In 1934, engineers at Bofors AB, a Swedish arms manufacturer in Karlskoga, perfected the 40mm L/60 autocannon, a revolutionary anti-aircraft weapon that balanced firepower, rate of fire, and crew mobility. The Bofors 40mm fired 2-pound high-explosive shells at 120 rounds per minute, with an effective range of 5,000 yards and a maximum ceiling of 23,000 feet. Unlike heavier anti-aircraft guns that required complex fire control systems and large crews, the Bofors could be operated by a 4 to 7-man team using relatively simple optical sights. By 1940, the design had earned international recognition. Britain, France, and Poland acquired production licenses. When the United States entered World War II in December 1941, military planners immediately recognized the Bofors as the missing link in naval air defense. American industrial capacity transformed the Swedish design into a mass-produced phenomenon. The U.S. Navy acquired production rights in 1941 and distributed manufacturing across civilian factories retooled for war production. Chrysler's automotive plants in Detroit began producing gun barrels and receivers. Pontiac facilities manufactured ammunition feeds and breeches. Firestone Tire and Rubber Company, pivoting from civilian tires to military hardware, produced gun mounts and hydraulic systems. York Safe and Lock Company built the intricate timing mechanisms. By 1942, American factories were producing Bofors guns at a rate that dwarfed original Swedish output. Where Bofors AB had manufactured approximately 2,000 guns between 1934 and 1940, American industry produced over 60,000 40mm mounts between 1942 and 1945, a 30-fold increase in one-third the time. This wasn't adaptation, it was industrial dominance on an incomprehensible scale. The standard naval configuration mounted 4 Bofors guns on a single rotating platform, the quad mount. Each gun fired independently at 120 rounds per minute, creating a combined rate of 480 rounds per minute per mount. Large warships like battleships and aircraft carriers carried 8 to 12 quad mounts, delivering 3,840 to 5,760 rounds per minute of 40mm fire. Destroyers, smaller and more vulnerable, typically mounted 2 to 4 quad mounts, still capable of throwing 960 to 1,920 rounds per minute into the air. The ammunition itself was lethal. Each 40mm shell contained 60 grams of high explosive with a contact fuse designed to detonate on impact with aircraft structures. The explosive fragmentation could shred aluminum airframes, sever control cables, puncture fuel tanks, and kill pilots, even without direct structural hits. A single 40mm shell striking an aircraft's wing or fuselage often proved catastrophic. But the Bofors gun alone wasn't the revolution. It was the fire control integration that multiplied effectiveness. The U.S. Navy paired Bofors mounts with the Mk-51 Director, a gyroscopic lead computing gun sight that calculated target speed, direction, and range, then provided continuous firing solutions to gun crews. Optical rangefinders measured distance, while gyroscopes compensated for ship motion in rough seas. By late 1944, radar cueing became standard. Surface search and air search radars detected incoming aircraft and automatically slaved Mk-51 Directors to initial bearings, cutting target acquisition time to under 4 seconds. Gun crews didn't need to spot aircraft visually before engaging. Radar told them where to point, and optical tracking refined the aim. The system transformed scattered defensive fire into coordinated overlapping kill zones. Crew training elevated the system from effective to devastating. American gunners underwent 200 to 300 hours of training before deployment, classroom instruction on aircraft recognition, ballistics, and fire control theory, followed by live fire exercises against towed targets and radio-controlled drones. Gun crews drilled until loading, aiming, and firing became muscle memory, executed under stress without conscious thought. 4-man loading teams could maintain 120 rounds per minute for sustained periods, swapping out barrel assemblies when overheating degraded accuracy. Ammunition handlers formed human chains from magazines to gun mounts, passing 4-round clips in continuous streams. Damage control teams stood ready with fire extinguishers and repair equipment. The Bofors wasn't just a weapon, it was an integrated system combining mechanical precision, electronic calculation, and relentless human execution. Yet even this formidable system had limitations against maneuvering targets. Traditional 40mm ammunition used contact or timed fuses. The shell either had to strike the aircraft directly or the fuse had to be preset to detonate at a specific altitude and range. Against conventional attackers who jinked, dove, and climbed unpredictably, timed fuses achieved hit rates of only 1 to 2%. Gunners had to predict where the target would be seconds in the future, set the fuse accordingly, and hope their calculations matched reality. Kamikaze pilots, committed to straight-line dives, were easier to track, but even so, killing an aircraft before it reached the ship required direct hits on small, fast-moving targets. The mathematics remained brutally unfavorable until the proximity fuse changed everything. The VT proximity fuse, developed under extraordinary secrecy at Johns Hopkins University's Applied Physics Laboratory, represented one of World War II's most significant technological breakthroughs. A miniature radio transmitter and receiver, small enough to fit inside a 40mm shell, emitted continuous radio waves during flight. When the shell passed within approximately 70 feet of a metal object, an aircraft, the reflected radio signal triggered detonation. The pilot didn't need to be hit directly, the shell simply needed to pass nearby. The proximity fuse created a lethal blast radius around each shell, multiplying effective kill zones 20 to 30-fold. Suddenly, hit rates jumped from 1 to 2% to 20 to 30%. A gun firing 120 rounds per minute with proximity fuses was statistically guaranteed multiple kills against any aircraft within range. The technology was so sensitive that the U.S. military prohibited its use over land until 1944, fearing that unexploded shells might reveal the secret to enemies. By early 1945, with Allied victory increasingly certain, proximity-fused, 40mm ammunition flooded the Pacific Fleet. Lieutenant James G. Tull, gunnery officer aboard USS St, watched his crews load the new ammunition during refitting in March 1945. Each shell looked identical to standard rounds, but the nose cap concealed revolutionary electronics. Tull had read the technical briefings. Proximity fuses would create walls of fire, where every shell became a miniature grenade, detonating near targets. He'd also heard the whispers from other ships. Kamikazes were still getting through, still sinking destroyers, still killing sailors. On April 12, 1945, Laffy would steam to Radar Picket Station 1, 50 miles north of Okinawa, and face the ultimate test. Tull's Bofors crews were trained, equipped, and ready. The question that kept him awake wasn't whether the technology worked, it was whether it would be enough against pilots willing to die for every meter gained. The answer would come in blood, fire, and mathematics. The Mitsubishi A6M0, once the most feared fighter in the Pacific, had become a coffin with wings by 1945. When it first entered combat in 1940, the Zero dominated Allied aircraft through superior maneuverability, range, and climb rate. Its Nakajima Sakai 12 radial engine produced 940 horsepower, pushing the aircraft to 331 miles per hour at optimal altitude with a combat radius exceeding 1,930 miles, performance that allowed Japanese carrier groups to strike across vast Pacific distances. Armed with two 20mm Type 99 cannons and two 7.7mm machine guns, the Zero could engage enemy fighters while carrying a 250-kilogram bomb for ground attack missions. Between 1940 and 1945, Mitsubishi and Nakajima factories produced approximately 10,800 Zeros in all variants. But by April 1945, this production total represented an insurmountable limitation. Every Zero lost was effectively irreplaceable, sir. Japanese industry, crippled by American submarine warfare and strategic bombing, could no longer manufacture aircraft at rates matching combat losses. The kamikazes flying Zeros in 1945 piloted degraded machines maintained by exhausted ground crews with vanishing spare parts. Engine overhauls, normally required every 150 to 200 flight hours, were delayed or skipped entirely. Spark plugs fouled and went unchanged. Time 00.5's hydraulic fluid leaked from worn seals. Control cables frayed and stretched without replacement. Tires, patched repeatedly, frequently blew on takeoff. Many Zeros assigned to kamikaze units were combat veterans, aircraft that had survived multiple engagements, accumulated battle damage, and been patched with whatever materials remained available. Flight Sergeant Tota Nishimitsu, a maintenance officer with the 343rd Naval Air Group before reassignment to kamikaze support duties, later described the reality. "We sent young men to die in aircraft that should have been grounded. Engines that missed on 2 cylinders, wings with fabric patches over bullet holes. We had no choice, there were no replacement aircraft." For kamikaze missions, mechanical reliability mattered less than simply reaching the target. If the engine failed after the pilot sighted American ships, momentum and gravity would complete the mission. Fuel shortages compounded mechanical degradation into catastrophic vulnerability. Japan's oil supplies, dependent on imports from the Dutch East Indies and Borneo, had been severed by American submarine campaigns and the liberation of the Philippines. By 1945, Japan's remaining refineries produced synthetic aviation fuel derived from coal, pine root resin, and potato alcohol, desperate substitutes that never matched petroleum-based fuel quality. Standard Japanese aviation fuel in 1945 measured 80 to 87 octane compared to the 100 to 130 octane fuel American aircraft used. Lower octane fuel reduced engine power output, increased detonation risk under stress, and fouled spark plugs faster. Worse, fuel allocations were so restricted that kamikaze aircraft often carried only enough fuel for a one-way trip, enough to reach Okinawa's waters, but not enough to return if the mission was aborted. Pilots took off knowing that hesitation, navigational error, or mechanical failure meant death by fuel starvation, even if they avoided American guns. The training collapse represented perhaps the most devastating capability gap. In 1941, Japanese naval aviators completed training programs requiring 300 to 700 flight hours before operational deployment. Pilots practiced navigation, aerobatics, gunnery, formation flying, and carrier operations until skills became instinctive. The elite carrier pilots who struck Pearl Harbor averaged over 800 hours flight time experience, levels matching or exceeding their American counterparts. But 4 years of attrition warfare had killed those veterans. By 1945, Japan's pilot training pipeline, strangled by fuel shortages and the need to rush replacements into combat, produced kamikaze volunteers with 90 to 120 total flight hours. Some had as few as 60 hours, barely enough to master basic takeoff and landing. Navigation training, complex and fuel-intensive, was reduced to rudimentary map reading and compass work. Kamikaze pilots received minimal instruction on evasive maneuvers because evasion wasn't part of their mission profile. They learned to fly straight, recognize American ship silhouettes, and aim for the superstructure or flight deck. That was enough to die. It wasn't enough to survive American defenses. Lieutenant Yukio Seki, who led the first organized kamikaze attack that sank USS St. had been an experienced pilot with over 500 flight hours. By April 1945, such experience was nearly extinct. The young men volunteering or being volunteered for Kikusui missions were teenagers with minimal flight time, poor navigation skills, and no combat experience. Many had never fired their aircraft's guns in anger. Some had never flown over open ocean before their final mission. American intelligence officers, interrogating captured kamikaze pilots whose aircraft had been forced down by mechanical failure or combat damage, reported shock at how unprepared the pilots were. One 19-year-old pilot, rescued from Okinawa waters after his engine failed, admitted he'd received 74 total flight hours and had never flown at night or in bad weather. He'd memorized a route to Okinawa by landmarks that disappeared in clouds. When asked how he expected to hit a maneuvering ship, he replied simply, "I didn't expect to. I expected to die trying." The capability gap wasn't merely technical, it was existential, measured in resources Japan no longer possessed. American gunners manning Bofors mounts had completed 200 to 300 hours of training on their weapon systems alone, separate from prior military training. They were well-fed, properly rested in rotation, and backed by unlimited ammunition, fuel, and replacement parts. Medical care, hot meals, and mail from home maintained morale. When gun barrels overheated, replacements were swapped in within minutes. When ammunition ran low, resupply ships delivered thousands of rounds. When fatigue degraded performance, fresh crews rotated in. The industrial and logistical infrastructure supporting American forces operated at a scale Japan could no longer imagine, let alone match. Seaman First Class Robert W. Hogan, serving aboard destroyer USS Bowers, later recalled the surreal abundance. "We fired thousands of rounds per engagement." Thousands. The shells just kept coming from below decks. I remember thinking, how do we even carry this much ammunition? It never seemed to run out. Standing in stark contrast, Japanese kamikaze pilots rationed fuel measured in liters, flew unreliable aircraft maintained with improvised parts, and consumed rice rations that had shrunk to near starvation levels. Many pilots were malnourished, their reflexes and cognitive function degraded by caloric deficits. Medical care was minimal. Injuries and illnesses that would have grounded American pilots went untreated in Japan. The psychological burden added another layer of suffering. While some pilots genuinely embraced kamikaze duty as honorable sacrifice, many were coerced through social pressure, family shame, or direct orders, leaving no honorable path to refusal. Letters recovered from deceased kamikaze pilots revealed doubt, fear, and resignation more than fanaticism. One pilot wrote to his family, "I do not want to die. I want to live and see you again. But I cannot refuse. Please forgive me for being weak." The mathematics of desperation versus abundance crystallized in a single comparison. The United States produced over 60,000 Bofors anti-aircraft mounts during the war, while Japan's entire zero production across all variants totaled 10,800 aircraft. American factories could replace losses faster than combat-destroyed guns. Japanese factories couldn't replace losses at all. Every kamikaze pilot who died was irreplaceable. Every aircraft destroyed removed capability that would never return. The attrition mathematics, brutal from the beginning, had become mathematically insurmountable. Lieutenant Commander Tadashi Nakajima, a staff officer with the 5th Air Fleet responsible for organizing Kikusui attacks, wrote in his diary, "We are sending children to fight industrial giants with tools from another era. We tell them their spirit will overcome material disadvantage. We lie to them because we have nothing else to give. The capability chasm wasn't a gap, it was an abyss. And into that abyss, Japan continued to send young men with orders to die gloriously while American guns turned glory into statistics. On April 12, 1945, that abyss would be measured in tracer fire, proximity-fused explosions, and bodies falling into the Pacific. USS Laffey's crew, manning their Swedish-designed guns loaded with American proximity-fused shells, would face 22 kamikazes flown by pilots with minimal training in degraded aircraft running on synthetic fuel. The outcome was never in doubt, only the cost. The walls of fire were about to demonstrate what industrial warfare truly meant, that courage, honor, and sacrifice, however profound, could not overcome saturation firepower backed by limitless resources. The mathematics were cruel, absolute, and undeniable. Determination couldn't defeat physics. Spirit couldn't overcome engineering. And human will, no matter how strong, shattered against industrial reality like waves against steel. April 12, 1945, 0730 hours. USS Laffey, a Sumner-class destroyer bearing hull number DD-724, steamed into position at Radar Picket Station 1, approximately 16 miles north of Okinawa's coastline. Commander Frederick Julian Beckton, Laffey's commanding officer, scanned the horizon as his crew secured from morning battle stations. The sea lay calm under broken clouds, visibility extending for miles. Laffey carried a crew of 336 officers and men, along with formidable armament, 6 5-inch dual-purpose guns in 3 twin turrets, 12 40mm Bofors guns mounted in 3 quad configurations, and 11 20mm Oerlikon cannons distributed across the superstructure. The destroyer's mission was brutally simple: detect incoming kamikaze raids early, vector combat air patrol fighters to intercept, and survive whatever penetrated the fighter screen. Beckton had read the casualty reports from other picket stations. He knew survival wasn't guaranteed. At 0827 hours, Laffey's air search radar painted multiple contacts inbound from the north. Initial count showed over 50 aircraft. General quarters sounded. This was it. The first wave materialized at 0839 hours. 4 Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers emerged from cloud cover at 8,000 feet, noses dropping into attack dives targeting Laffey's starboard side. Gun director officers barked ranges and bearings. The 5-inch guns opened fire first, their shells arcing upward with timed fuses set for altitude bursts. Then the Bofors mounts engaged. 3 quad mounts, 12 guns total, swung toward the diving valves and opened fire at a combined rate of 1,440 rounds per minute. Tracer rounds, loaded every 5th shell to mark the stream of fire, drew glowing lines from Laffey's deck toward the approaching aircraft. The proximity-fused shells needed no direct hits. At 5,000 yards, the first Val encountered a wall of detonations, 40mm shells exploding within 70 feet of the aircraft's fuselage, peppering aluminum skin with shrapnel fragments. The Val's left wing disintegrated. The aircraft tumbled sideways, spinning into the ocean 2,000 yards from Laffey's hull. 2 more Vals followed, both encountering the same impenetrable curtain of fire. One exploded in midair when a proximity-fused shell detonated directly beneath the cockpit. The fourth valve, trailing smoke from its engine, pulled up and fled north, too damaged to continue. Elapsed time, 90 seconds. 3 valves destroyed, 1 driven off. The walls of fire worked exactly as promised, but the reprieve lasted only minutes. At 0842 hours, 6 Mitsubishi A6M0s approached from the port quarter, flying low, 50 feet above the wave tops, hoping to evade radar detection until the final moment. Laffey's lookouts spotted them visually and screamed warnings. The Bofors crews traversed their mounts, gun barrels depressing to engage the sea-skimming attackers. Proximity fuses were less effective against targets flying near the water. The ocean's surface reflected enough radio signal to cause premature detonations. Gunners switched to contact-fused ammunition, requiring direct hits. The lead Zero closed to 3,000 yards. Laffey's portside Bofors mount opened fire, shells kicking up waterspouts as gunners walked their fire toward the target. At 2,000 yards, a burst caught the Zero's engine cowling, punching through metal and igniting fuel lines. The aircraft cartwheeled into the sea. The second Zero jinked right trying to evade, but flew directly into fire from Laffey's 20mm Oerlikon cannons. The lighter guns, firing 450 rounds per minute, shredded the Zero's tail section. The aircraft nosed down, impacting the water at 300 miles per hour and disintegrating. 4 more Zeros pressed the attack. The Bofors mounts, barrels already heating from sustained fire, continued their mechanical rhythm: load, fire, eject, load, fire, eject. 120 rounds per minute per gun without pause. At 0844 hours, the first kamikaze broke through. A Zero, engine smoking and wings perforated by dozens of hits, stayed airborne through sheer momentum. The pilot, likely dead or dying in his cockpit, had locked the controls on target. The aircraft slammed into Laffey's aft 5-inch gun mount, its 250-kilogram bomb detonating on impact. The explosion killed the gun crew instantly, ripped a 10-foot hole in the deck, and started fires in the ammunition handling room below. Damage control teams sprinted aft with fire hoses and extinguishers. Secondary explosions from stored ammunition sent shrapnel scattering across the fantail. Laffey shuddered, speed dropping, as the engineering crew diverted steam pressure to fire suppression systems. Commander Beckton, on the bridge, received the damage report and made the immediate calculation. They were hurt, but still functional. The Bofors mounts, critically, remained operational. The fight continued. The next 70 minutes devolved into mechanized slaughter, punctuated by moments of sheer terror. Wave after wave of kamikazes approached Laffey from every bearing, north, south, east, west, as if drawn magnetically to the crippled destroyer. Japanese pilots, spotting smoke from the earlier hit, recognized a wounded target and converged. Laffey's Bofors crews fired until their barrels glowed cherry red, the heat visible even in daylight. Gunners wore asbestos gloves to handle ammunition clips, the metal so hot it blistered unprotected skin. Barrel changes, normally performed during lulls, happened during active engagements, crews racing against time while aircraft dove toward them. Ammunition handlers formed human chains from the magazines, passing 4-round clips hand-to-hand in continuous streams. Men slipped on spent shell casings that covered the deck like brass snow. The noise was overwhelming, Bofors firing, 5-inch guns booming, 20mm cannons chattering, officers screaming orders, wounded men screaming in pain. Seaman First Class Robert W. Hogan, manning a Bofors loader position, later described the surreal detachment. You stopped thinking. You just loaded. Clip after clip. You didn't see aircraft anymore, just targets. Load, they fire, target explodes, load again. It became mechanical. The only time you felt anything was when they got through. They got through 4 more times. At 0851 hours, a Zero crashed into the forward 5-inch gun director, killing everyone inside and knocking out fire control for the forward guns. At 0906 hours, a D3A valve penetrated the Bofors fire and smashed into the starboard side amidships, blowing a 15-foot hole below the waterline. Seawater flooded 2 compartments. Laffey listed 5 degrees to starboard. At 0918 hours, another Zero, in flames from stern to cockpit, hit the aft deckhouse, starting fires that threatened the ammunition magazines. At 0929 hours, a fourth kamikaze, flying through a storm of tracers that tore off its landing gear and shredded its tail, crashed into the stern, its bomb detonating in the crew's mess hall. 31 men died instantly. The explosions, fires, and flooding should have sunk Laffy. Damage control teams, working in smoke-filled compartments with flashlights and hand pumps, kept the destroyer afloat through sheer determination and training. But the Bofors guns never stopped firing. By 0945 hours, Laffy's gun crews had fired over 8,000 rounds of 40mm ammunition, nearly 70% of the destroyer's total load. 3 of the 4 quad mounts remained operational, though with barrels so worn that accuracy had degraded noticeably. The 4th mount had suffered a mechanical failure, its elevation mechanism jammed by shrapnel damage. Still, the 3 functioning mounts maintained fire discipline, engaging new targets as fast as they appeared. At 0947 hours, combat air patrol fighters, F-4U Corsairs from USS Bennington, finally arrived overhead, having been vectored from another picket station. The Corsairs tore into the remaining kamikazes, downing 3 in rapid succession with cannon fire. The Japanese aircraft broke off. The sky cleared. At 0950 hours, Commander Beckton ordered ceasefire. Silence, sudden and shocking. After 80 minutes of uninterrupted noise descended over the ship. Gunners collapsed beside their weapons, hands blistered, ears bleeding from acoustic trauma, lungs choked with cordite smoke. Laffy was a floating wreck. 5 major kamikaze hits, 32 dead, 71 wounded, listing, on fire, and barely maneuvering. But she was afloat. She had survived. The accounting was brutal and revealing. 22 kamikazes had targeted Laffy specifically during the 80-minute engagements. The Bofors mounts, firing 8,000-plus proximity-fused 40mm shells, had destroyed 9 kamikazes outright, aircraft that exploded in mid-air or disintegrated from shrapnel damage. 8 more kamikazes had been driven off or critically damaged, limping away trailing smoke and flames, unable to complete their attacks. 5 kamikazes had penetrated the defensive fire and struck the ship. The mathematics were stark. 17 of 22 stopped, a 77% intercept rate. Without the Bofors guns and proximity fuses, conventional anti-aircraft fire would have achieved perhaps a 20% intercept rate, meaning 17 or 18 hits instead of 5. Laffy would have sunk within 20 minutes. The walls of fire, despite allowing 5 breakthroughs, had saved the ship and 305 lives. Commander Beckton, surveying the wreckage of his ship while it limped toward Karama Retto anchorage for emergency repairs, understood what the statistical proof meant. The technology worked. The impossible defense, stopping human-guided missiles with gunfire alone, wasn't impossible anymore. It was repeatable, predictable, and devastatingly effective. Lieutenant James G. Tull, Laffy's gunnery officer, inspected the Bofors mounts after securing from general quarters. The barrels were scored and heat-warped. Shell casings, piled waist-deep around each mount, would take hours to clear. The gun crews, exhausted and traumatized, had performed flawlessly under conditions that should have broken men. Tull found one gunner, a 19-year-old from Ohio, sitting beside his weapon and crying silently. When Tull asked if he was injured, the young man shook his head. "I watched them die, sir. I watched them burn and fall. They kept coming even when they were on fire. I killed at least 6 myself. Maybe more, times 0.5s. They're kids, sir. Just kids like me." Tull had no answer. The walls of fire killed indiscriminately, experienced pilots and teenagers, volunteers and coerced victims, all became statistics in the brutal mathematics of industrial warfare. The Bofors didn't care about honor, courage, or sacrifice. The guns simply fired 120 rounds per minute. The proximity fuses detonated within 70 feet, and anything caught in the blast radius ceased to exist. That was the true horror and the true mercy. The walls of fire ended suffering quickly. For the kamikaze pilots flying into them, there was no prolonged agony, no drowning in the Pacific, no burning alive in a cockpit. There was only sudden violent cessation. Industrial warfare had evolved beyond cruelty into pure mechanical efficiency. USS St had proven it. The walls of fire worked. And across every radar picket station surrounding Okinawa, the same proof was being written in blood, fire, and falling bodies. USS St 80-minute stand proved what American naval commanders had desperately hoped. The Bofors 40mm gun equipped with proximity fuses could stop kamikaze attacks through sheer volume of fire. But St wasn't alone. Across the radar picket stations surrounding Okinawa, the same pattern repeated throughout April, May, and June 1945. Every destroyer, cruiser, and battleship equipped with Bofors mounts and proximity-fused ammunition achieved intercept rates between 65 and 80% against kamikaze attackers. The statistical evidence, compiled from hundreds of engagements and thousands of individual kamikaze sorties, told an unambiguous story. Industrial firepower had defeated tactical desperation. Between April 1st and June 22nd, 1945, Japanese forces launched 2,045 kamikaze sorties against Allied ships at Okinawa. American guns, primarily Bofors 40mm mounts supplemented by 5-inch and 20mm weapons, destroyed 1,465 kamikazes before impact, a 71% overall intercept rate. The remaining 580 kamikazes penetrated the defensive fire and struck ships, damaging 368 vessels and sinking 34 outright. The toll was horrific: 4,900 American sailors killed or wounded, more casualties than many entire island campaigns. Yet the fleet survived. Task Force 58 remained operational throughout the campaign. The invasion proceeded. The walls of fire held. The Japanese High Command, receiving reports from the few kamikaze pilots who survived aborted missions or mechanical failures, initially refused to believe the intercept rate claims. Early kamikaze attacks in the Philippines had achieved 40 to 50% success rates, nearly one hit for every 2 aircraft launched. The sudden collapse to 29% success at Okinawa seemed impossible. Surely the reports were exaggerated, American propaganda designed to demoralize Japanese forces. But the mathematics were undeniable. Sortie after sortie launched and failed to return. Ships that should have been sunk remained operational. Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, commander of the 5th Air Fleet responsible for kamikaze operations, wrote in his diary on May 4, 1945, "Our pilots report walls of fire so dense they cannot penetrate, shells exploding without contact, ships firing thousands of rounds without pause. I do not understand how they achieve this. Every tactical adjustment we attempt is countered within days. We send more planes and they shoot down more planes. The mathematics have turned against us and I see no way to reverse them." Ugaki's despair reflected a broader realization spreading through Japanese military leadership. The kamikaze strategy, conceived as Japan's ultimate weapon, had become a death mill, consuming irreplaceable pilots and aircraft while achieving diminishing returns. Tactical adaptations attempted by Japanese commanders failed systematically. When kamikazes began attacking at dawn and dusk to exploit low-light conditions, American radar-guided fire control systems proved equally effective in darkness. Proximity fuses didn't require visual targeting. When Japanese pilots tried coordinating simultaneous attacks from multiple bearings to overwhelm defensive fire, American ships formed mutually supporting formations where overlapping Bofors coverage created interlocking kill zones with no safe approach vector. When kamikazes attempted high-altitude dives to build speed and reduce exposure time, the Bofors' 23,000-foot ceiling and 5,000-yard range meant aircraft entered the kill zone earlier and longer. When pilots tried sea-skimming approaches below radar coverage, lookouts spotted them visually, and while proximity fuses were less effective near water, the sheer volume of fire compensated. Ships fired until the target disintegrated. Every innovation met an industrial counter-response delivered within days. American ammunition stocks never depleted. Replacement gun barrels arrived on resupply ships. Fresh crews rotated in. The defensive system adapted faster than Japanese tactics could evolve. The psychological impact on surviving kamikaze pilots approached complete collapse. Interrogations of captured pilots revealed consistent themes: shock at the density of fire, disbelief that aircraft could be destroyed without direct hits, terror at watching comrades vaporize in proximity, fused explosions, and resignation that missions were suicidal, not heroic. One captured pilot, 19-year-old Flight Petty Officer Koji Yamamoto, whose Zero's engine failed during his approach to the picket line, described his experience during interrogation. "I watched 5 aircraft ahead of me explode. Not hit, explode. The shells burst near them and they came apart. I thought the Americans had some kind of electrical death ray. When my engine quit and I had to ditch, I felt relief. I was glad to be captured instead of flying into that fire. I know that makes me a coward, but I wanted to live." American intelligence officers noted increasing numbers of kamikaze aircraft turning back with dubious mechanical problems, pilots choosing dishonor over certain death. By June 1945, kamikaze volunteer rates had collapsed. Units relied increasingly on coercion, assigning pilots to missions rather than accepting volunteers. Morale, never high in a strategy built on guaranteed death, disintegrated entirely. The strategic outcome was decisive, yet costly. Okinawa fell to American forces on June 22, 1945, after 82 days of brutal fighting. The island, just 340 miles from Japan's home islands, became the staging base for Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan itself. Despite 34 ships sunk and 368 damaged, the U.S. Navy's operational capability remained intact. Carriers launched strikes. Battleships provided fire support. Supply lines never broke. The Kamikaze campaign, which should have crippled the invasion fleet, had inflicted terrible casualties but failed strategically. Japanese forces had expended approximately 2,000 aircraft and pilots, irreplaceable losses that couldn't be regenerated before the anticipated invasion. American forces, by contrast, suffered 4,900 naval casualties, but retained their industrial capacity to build replacement ships, train new crews, and produce unlimited ammunition. The attrition mathematics, brutal throughout the Pacific War, reached their logical conclusion at Okinawa. Japan's human resources, however courageously deployed, couldn't overcome American industrial output. Lieutenant Commander Tadashi Nakajima, the 5th Air Fleet staff officer who had organized kamikaze missions, wrote his final diary entry on June 15th, 1 week before Okinawa's fall. "We have failed. The special attacks achieved nothing except the deaths of our best young men. The Americans' anti-aircraft fire has become a wall we cannot penetrate. I recommended to Admiral Ugaki that we cease kamikaze operations entirely and preserve remaining pilots for homeland defense. He refused. The attacks will continue until we have no pilots left. Then Japan will fall. We have chosen national suicide, and I am complicit in that choice. I do not expect to survive what comes next." The human cost extended far beyond statistics. For American sailors who survived kamikaze strikes, psychological trauma proved as debilitating as physical wounds. Decades after the war, veterans of the Okinawa picket line reported nightmares, survivor's guilt, and intrusive memories of burning aircraft and dying pilots. Gunners who had killed dozens of kamikazes struggled with moral injury, the knowledge that they'd killed teenagers and young men who never had a choice. Lieutenant James G. Tull, Laffey's gunnery officer, wrote in a 1968 letter to a researcher, "We did our duty and saved our ship. But I've never celebrated it. Those pilots we shot down were kids, most of them. Brave kids sent on suicide missions by commanders who had run out of options. Yes, they were trying to kill us. Yes, we had to stop them. But there's no glory in industrial slaughter. The Bofors guns worked exactly as designed. They turned human beings into statistics. That's what modern warfare is, reducing people to numbers and then calculating efficient ways to make the numbers stop." For Japanese families who received notification that their sons had died in kamikaze attacks, the trauma was compounded by decades of cultural mythology that portrayed the deaths as heroic and meaningful. Only in recent decades have Japanese historians begun examining kamikaze operations with critical honesty, acknowledging the coercion, waste, and strategic futility. The historical legacy of Okinawa's walls of fire extended far beyond World War II. The Bofors 40mm gun remained in service with the U.S. Navy through the Korean War and into the Vietnam era. Gradually replaced by more sophisticated systems, but validated as one of history's most effective anti-aircraft weapons. The proximity fuse, initially developed for anti-aircraft use, revolutionized artillery warfare. Post-war versions, adapted for ground combat, multiplied artillery effectiveness against personnel and vehicles. The tactical lessons learned at Okinawa that massed radar-guided automatic weapons could defeat even suicidal attackers shaped Cold War air defense doctrine. Soviet, American, and NATO forces all developed similar systems: high rate of fire autocannons, radar guidance, and proximity-fused ammunition, designed to create defensive barriers against aircraft and missiles. The principle established by Bofors crews in 1945 remained central to air defense into the 21st century. Sufficient volume of fire, properly directed, defeats any airborne threat regardless of the attacker's determination. Yet the experience at Okinawa also contributed to one of history's most consequential decisions. American military planners, projecting casualties for Operation Downfall's planned invasion of Japan, used Okinawa as their baseline. Despite the effectiveness of anti-aircraft defenses, 4,900 naval casualties and 34 ships sunk represented losses American commanders considered barely acceptable for a single island campaign. Projections for invading Kyushu and Honshu anticipated millions of casualties, Japanese and American, based on the fanatical resistance encountered at Okinawa. The Kamikaze campaign, though militarily defeated, had demonstrated that Japanese forces would resist to total annihilation rather than surrender. This calculus, combined with the successful testing of atomic weapons in July 1945, contributed to President Truman's decision to authorize atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The walls of fire at Okinawa had saved the invasion fleet, but the casualties inflicted helped convince American leadership that conventional invasion would require unacceptable bloodshed. The atomic bombs, terrible as they were, ended the war without Operation Downfalls. Whether that decision was justified remains debated, but the context is undeniable. Okinawa showed that defeating Japan conventionally would require fighting through walls of fire on every beach in every city until nothing remained. On April 12, 1945, Lieutenant Seizō Yasunori dove his Zero toward USS Laffey, encountered walls of 40mm fire that defied everything he'd been promised, and died in an explosion that statistics would record but history would struggle to memorialize meaningfully. His death, and the deaths of 1,464 other kamikaze pilots destroyed over Okinawa, proved that courage and determination, however absolute, cannot overcome industrial mathematics. Swedish-designed guns, American mass production, and proximity-fused shells created defensive barriers that human will alone could never penetrate. The impossible had become routine. The walls of fire, mere anti-aircraft guns stopping suicide attackers, had transformed from desperate hope into statistical certainty. Industrial warfare's final lesson, written in tracer fire and falling bodies across Okinawa's skies, was this: no amount of sacrifice can defeat an enemy with unlimited resources, superior technology, and the industrial capacity to produce walls of fire faster than attackers can be trained to fly through them. The mathematics were cruel, absolute, and undeniable. The kamikazes learned that lesson at the cost of 2,000 lives. The walls of fire taught it without mercy, 120 rounds per minute at a time,